Good morning, and welcome to this conversation with Nouriel Roubini. I'm Simon Nixon. I'm an independent journalist, and I'm the publisher of the Wealth of Nations newsletter, which you can find on Substack. Nouriel doesn't need any introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. He's the Professor Emeritus at the New York Stern School of Business, the CEO of Roubini Macro Associates. He's a former senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. He's worked for the IMF, the World Bank, the US Federal Reserve, and he's the author of several books, including Crisis Economics, a Crash Course in the Future of Finance. He's also quite famously known as Dr. Doom, and so hopefully today, though, he'll spread a bit of optimism onto the proceedings. Nouriel, this is an extraordinary moment to be having this conversation. So we should start by discussing what just happened. What caused Trump to blink, do you think, last night on his tariff war? Do you think it was the Republicans Party? Was it the bond market? Was it pressure from business, from donors? Or do you think that there was something potentially nasty lurking in the financial system threatening to blow up?
Yes, usually, they call me Dr. Doom, but actually I've been contrarian even in the last week or two. Wall Street is now predicting a US and global recession, and I argue that actually we may be able to avoid it. So I'm actually Dr. Boom rather than Doom in relative terms. And the reason is as follows. In December I wrote a piece speaking about the good, the bad, and the uncertain about Trump's economic policy. And I argued that a whole bunch of things will be reducing growth and increasing inflation, starting with protectionism, tariff, trade war, restricted migration. And then other policies will be positive for growth, being pro-business, reducing taxes. But I made the argument there'll be four major guardrails that would constrain bad policies. One, market discipline. Two, Fed discipline. Three, decent economic advisors. And four, a small majority in Congress. And that's exactly what worked. Market discipline. Initially, the stock market fell, but it did not care as much about the stock market because in the US, 80% of the stock market is owned by 10% of the people. So when the market went down 10%, the impact on the economy will be very small. And this time around is really populist. It cares about those left behind, the blue collars, as opposed to the billionaires. But what happened was in the last 2 days, not only the stock market went from correction to bear market, meaning minus 20, but bond yields that had fallen started to rise sharply. And credit spread started to rise sharply. And the dollar started to fall in a disorderly way. And therefore, the combination of the bond vigilantes, the stock market vigilantes, the credit market vigilantes, that imposed market discipline. Because at that point, the tightening of financial condition could lead to a collapse, not just of the markets, but of the economy. And I said, market discipline works. More than 20 years ago, the main advisor of Bill Clinton, Jim Carville, said two things. One, it's the economy stupid. And the second thing he said was, in my next life, I don't want to be born as the Pope or the President of the United States. I want to be reborn as the bond vigilantes, because I can go and beat around all the people who have stupid policies. And get what? Trump can control his party, Congress can control the Supreme Court, he controls even social media, he's controlling X, and he's going to control TikTok, but he cannot control investors. And the bond vigilantes, together with the stock market vigilantes, together with the credit market vigilantes, forced him to back down and blink. Compared to most of the world, China is a different story. I argue that the collision course between US and China is going to continue, but it will blink relative to the rest of the world. Point number one. Point number two, Fed discipline. There was a game of chicken between Trump, Powell, and Xi Jinping. And in this game of chicken, I argued that Powell will not blink. Because if Powell blinks and it cuts interest rates, when the tariff is going to lead to inflation, it's going to be a disaster. It's a disaster not only for the Fed, but also for bond yields and even for Trump. So in that game of chicken, there was a Trump put at which point, at which price of the stock market it would blink. It was a Powell put. There was at which point Powell would blink if the stock market collapses. But Powell did not care about the stock market. He cared about bond yields and credit spreads. And in that game of chicken, the strike price for Trump was higher than the one of Powell. So Powell did not blink. Trump had to blink. Same thing in the game of chicken between Trump and Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping can wait out Trump because he doesn't face election. He can stimulate monetary policy, fiscal policy, use the currency, and structural reform. And therefore, Xi Jinping did not back down, and the trade war has escalated. So Fed discipline forced the Fed to blink. So Fed discipline forced Trump to blink. Market discipline forced Trump to blink. 3, the economic advisor who told him escalate to de-escalate, Bessent, Miran had the upper hand compared to the Navarros, the Latniks of the world. Eventually they had the upper hand. And 4, he has a very thin majority in Congress, and Congress started to say, if you're doing these stupid things and are going to destroy the economy for our constituency, we're going to restrict your trade negotiation power. And there was that threat. So in December I said, market discipline, good advisor, Fed discipline and thin majority in Congress are going to guardrail him. Guess what? He backed down. Now the big issue is not negotiation with Europe, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Mexico, and Canada. With friends and allies, you're going to reach a deal. You'll have to reach a deal because friends and allies do not have leverage. Friends and allies need the security support of the US, NATO, in the case of Europe, and in Asia, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. So they have to compromise. They'll have to spend more on defense. They'll have to buy more US weapons. They're going to have to buy more US LNG. They're going to have to buy more US ag products. They'll have to de-risk from China. They'll have to let their currency gradually appreciate. They'll have to do some tariff jumping stuff in the United States. So there'll be a compromise, and eventually the tariff on Europe are not going to be 20%, they're going to be 10%. Is it a bad thing? Yes. But is it something that's going to destroy the US and the global economy? No. 10% tariff. The euro can go up and down 10, 20% in a matter of months. Used to be at 160, then parity, now at 110. So you can live with 10% tariff. So with most of the world, that's going to happen, and that reduces the market tensions and reduces the risk of a US and global recession. With China is a different story, because China, as I said, is worried that the US is out to destroy China, not only trade-wise, but also economically and also militarily. And therefore, for the time being, this game of chicken between the US and China is going to continue. The question is, who's going to blink, whether they can sit down and find a grand bargain. I fear that even if they sit down and try to negotiate, in the case of Europe and other allies, you can get a deal done, for sure, in 3 months, even in a month. With China, it's a bigger mess, and most likely, for now, we're escalating rather than de-escalating. And that's still a threat to US economic growth, to global economic growth, and to the markets.
Well, thank you. That was a pretty comprehensive answer to but you talked about the bond vigilantes and that Trump blinked because of the bond vigilantes. The bond vigilantes, the quote from James Carville has been around for sort of 25 years or something. We had a situation in Britain, my country, a couple of years ago with a prime minister who thankfully only lasted 6 weeks, who came in and did really stupid things, and the bond vigilantes did for her. But what does it say about the state of US policy making? This is the most powerful country in the world, the country that's a custodian of the global financial system, that it could make a policy error on this scale and require the bond vigilantes to correct it, that almost at risk of triggering a global financial crisis over a policy error. I mean, how can anyone have confidence now in the US political and financial system? And isn't that what we were seeing over the last week with these really strange moves in the dollar and in treasuries? Is the lasting damage of this to the financial system and to the question of the dollar and the dollar's status and as a safe haven, as a reserve currency?
Well, you know, you make a valid point that, of course, was a massive policy mistake. I expect that this policy mistake would do, but that those 4 guardrails, market discipline, Fed discipline, good advisors, and small majority in Congress are going to eventually constrain him, and they did. It took only a week, actually, for him to blink compared to the rest of the world. And, of course, the risk is that some of his policies lead to lower growth and higher inflation, trade protection, migration restrictions, having tax cuts that are unfunded that blow up the deficit, playing with the independence of the Fed, trying to have a disorderly fall of the US dollar, and weakening the rule of law, both domestically and in relation to the rest of the world. Those are the 6 negatives. There are, however, 6 policies of Trump that over time can increase growth and reduce inflation. Overall, he's still pro-business. He messed up in the last week, but the business sector told him enough is enough. And even those guys put pressure on him. 2, he wants to make his tax cuts permanent, the one of 17. Leaving aside how you finance it, lower taxes on labor, capital, and income is a good news. 3, he wants to reduce regulation. And after the GFC, we over-regulated, went from laissez-faire to over-regulation. If we're going to move to the middle, it's going to be good. 4, he wants to try to reduce by increasing fossil fuel production, reduce energy prices in the US. That will be disinflationary and attract energy-intensive production in the US. How he's going to do it is complicated. If he's able to do it, leaving aside the consequences on climate change, that's going to be positive. 5, is doing DOGE, and there is a lot of waste in the government sector. We can cut spending. I was just in Argentina. I met with Milei. He has done a 5% of GDP primary adjustment, cutting spending draconianly, and the economy, instead of contracting, has been booming. So there is fat in the government, and we can cut spending without having a negative impact on the economy. 6, and most important, he's lucky, because the US is on the verge of the biggest technological revolution in human history. Is AI, machine learning, and Gen AI, is robotic, automation, is quantum computing, is biomedical research, space exploration, exploitation, green tech, ag tech, fintech, mobility revolution, new material science, new weapon systems are going to be semi-autonomous. There are at least 12 sectors that are going to be all driven by AI, going to lead to a productivity boom. US potential growth is estimated by the Fed today to be only 1.8%. I tell you, by the end of this decade, it's going to be 4%. And by the end of the next decade, it's going to be 6%. This is a situation for the first time in history where we have exponential growth and innovation. In the past, all innovation are logarithmic. They increase growth and then they flatten out. In this case, it's exponential. So if you believe that story, American exceptionalism is going to remain. And those innovations are going to be first in the US, then in China, and less so, but also in other parts of the world. And at the end of the day, tech trumps tariffs, meaning the impact of tech innovation are going to increase growth from 2 to 4%. That's a 200 basis points increase in growth. How much damage can a tariff war do? Maybe 30 basis points, maybe 50 basis points of potential growth. 200 basis points plus, negative of 50. It's a ratio between 4 to 1. So even if there was a trade war, and even if it was a recession this year, by the end of the decade, US is growing at 4%, and those kind of innovation are going to spill over to the rest of the world in a positive way. But of course, those who innovate, US and China, are going to do better than those who innovate less and are adapting technology. But even those who adapt this new technology, even Greece can benefit from adapting fast enough AI. You're not going to innovate, but you're going to adapt, so you can benefit from that. So tech trumps tariffs, not only in 2030, but the tailwinds of technology have led to a productivity boom in the US and a capex boom that is occurring right now. We had growth close to 3% in the US for the last 2 years. Why? The hyperscalers, the Mag 7, the company of the NASDAQ, even the corporates cannot afford to wait. Because if you don't invest into AI, you're going to be left behind. And therefore, they don't care about this tariff. If you ask the Mag 7, if you ask the hyperscaler, do you care about this trade war? They say, we don't. We have to invest into AI because if Apple doesn't do it, Google will do it. If Google doesn't do it, Meta will do it. If Meta is not going to do it, Amazon is going to do it. They're all to invest. So In the US, you could have President Trump, President Harris, or President Mickey Mouse. It doesn't matter. Mickey Mouse could run the United States. The dynamism of the US private sector is such that there's productivity growth is going to be a tailwind, not only on the medium term, but even this year. That's one of the forces that prevents a recession from occurring even this year. Of course, you need to back down. Of course, you have to find negotiation with most of the world, hopefully even with China. But take Trump's tariff in the short run and over the medium term.
Well, I can see really are Dr. Boom with these days with that outlook. Right? But I share your sort of long-term optimism. But just going back to this today, do you think realistic in 90 days that he can negotiate trade agreements with most of the world, given that these agreements normally take years?
I think he can, because if you're European, and I've been telling the Europeans literally for the last 9 months, even before the election, suppose Trump comes and imposes those tariffs, what do? Do you retaliate? You have no bargaining power, because it's going to destroy your economy if tariffs remain at, say, 20% relative to Europe. So you sit down and you tell him, what do you want? And he's going to say, you know, you have to spend more on defense. And by the way, 2% of GDP is not a ceiling right now, it's a floor. You need to spend more than 2, probably 3. You have to do it because he's telling you, but it's also good for you Europeans. You have to start defending yourself because there is a Russian there and there are other threats. So you have to go to 3. Once you go to 3, you cannot just spend it all on European defense spending, procurement, because you don't have the supply chains. It's delusional to think that tomorrow you're going to buy only European military equipment. You'll have to buy some American one. That's the story. Maybe 10 years from now, you're going to be independent. When the Germans announced more spending on defense, they said clearly, we cannot spend $25 million for tanks that can be destroyed by a $10,000 drone. So you need defense tech. Where do you have defense tech in Europe? There is no defense tech. There is some defense tech in Ukraine. There is defense tech in the United States. For the time being, you buy the F-35, you buy the defense tech from the US. Then you buy what? LNG from the US. US has tons of natural gas. It's creating pipeline, liquefying it to sell it to Europe. You want to rely again on Russia for your natural gas? Of course not. The US is going to sell you tons of LNG. You have to buy more ag goods from the United States. Of course, your farmers in Greece and otherwise are going to complain. You're going to subsidize them the same way Trump is subsidizing the farmers in the US that are hurt by the trade war. Then you de-risk with China, and you need to de-risk with China with the United States. In things that are critical, like high tech and so on, you have no choice. You have to de-risk. Even in automobiles, China is destroying the European automobile market with their EVs. They've been subsidized for decades. You'll have to de-risk the relation with China. That's good. You'll have to do some tariff jumping investment in US. And guess what? Cheap energy in US. Natural gas costs 4 times less in US than Europe, implies that some industries from Europe will have to move to the United States. And you'll have to let the euro appreciate. And as I said, the euro is already going higher, has to go higher, it's too weak. And if you do those things, it's going to say, the best deal in human history, the best trade deal, I won. The Europeans have conceded. And it's still going to give you 10% tariff rather than 20, but 10% tariff, you can live with it. So that deal can be done in 4 weeks. You don't need 3 months if you want to do it. So that deal can be done with Europe, can be done with Mexico and Canada, can be done with Japan, with Taiwan, with South Korea. The big issue is going to be China. So these things can be done if there's political will to be doing it. And I guess the Europeans were smart enough not to retaliate. The retaliation were spare change, 21 billion of goods as opposed to 380 the US imposed tariff on. That's the wise thing to do. Don't retaliate, sit down with him, humor him, give him what he wants, and he's going to say, great deal, we're friends and allies again. That's what's going to happen.
And what about China? You present a, you say that there's a Xi put on the US-China trade war, but at the moment it seems both sides seem to think that the other is weak, and that the other side faces financial and societal collapse from this trade war. As you say, Xi has more, in many ways, Xi has more cards. He has domestic levers he can pull. But how do you see, in the immediate term, how damaging can this trade war be? How realistic is it that effectively the new Trump tariff, 125%, effectively brings US-China trade to an end? How effectively can America decouple completely from China, and how can the rest of the world deal with this trade war? And China has other options. Can China escalate in different ways? Has China got other pressure points it can apply? I mean, can this bit of the trade war remain very destabilizing to the global economy for the foreseeable future?
Well, you know, as you pointed out, and I've had before, in this game of chicken between Trump and Xi, neither side wants to blink for now. Xi Jinping has a bunch of tools. Retaliate in the short run. He doesn't have to face midterm elections or no elections at all. He can do massive monetary stimulus, massive fiscal stimulus. He can let the currency weaken. He can try to divert trade to the BRI countries. He can do, finally, the structural reform. They're going to reduce savings and increase consumption. And maybe the Trump shock is good for China because it's going to force China to do what they've not done. By the way, the Trump shock is also good for Europe because Europe needed reform, and Europe does reform only when there is a crisis, the global financial crisis, the COVID crisis. So the Trump crisis is going to force Europeans to do what's necessary. So Xi Jinping in the short run can do a bunch of things, and he can retaliate, not just with tariffs. He can control the exports of rare earths. He can export the refining of green metals, starting with copper and all the other one. He can punish $1 trillion investment the US firm have done to China. He can do a whole bunch of things to hurt. So he has leverage. Over the medium term, of course, US has more leverage than China because everybody in the rest of the world is running a trade surplus with the United States. So when you have a trade war, growth is going to fall in the US, but growth is going to fall more in the rest of the world because the demand shock to the rest of the world is bigger than the inflation shock to the United States. So the trade war implies lower growth in the US and higher inflation, but implies lower growth and lower inflation in the rest of the world because of the demand shock. And it hurts the rest of the world more because they run trade surpluses that are large as a share of their own GDP, while in the US, imports are only 15% of GDP. So over the medium term, actually, if the trade war occurs, China has to lose more. But in the short run, China can wait out Trump. And in the long term, China could try to do the reform that increase the safety net, that reduce domestic saving, that increase consumption, so that they rely less on net exports to the US and the rest of the world. Maybe that's actually the right solution. Because think of it this way, what Trump has done is totally unfair and crazy, but China is 30% of global manufacturing. He knows how to do production. He doesn't know how to do domestic consumption. Has too much savings compared to investment, too much production compared to consumption, and is dumping the excess capacity in global market. And that, by the way, is not acceptable, not just the US, but even to Europe. Europe will have to deal with the fact that the entire green tech of Europe, or EVs, or cars, are going to be destroyed by China. And I was recently in places like Global South, in India, in South Africa, in Brazil. And even India, South Africa, and Brazil, that are middle powers, swing states in between US and China, they say we don't want to have our own manufacturing sector destroyed by the excess capacity of China. We have a job problem, we have a growth problem, we have a manufacturing growth issue. We cannot allow China to dump it. Even the eternal friend of China, supposedly Russia, they are worried today that the Chinese cars are destroying the production of crappy Russian cars, okay? Even the Russians are worried about that, let alone the rest of the world. So either China learns how to consume rather than just produce, or otherwise there'll be a wave of protectionism against China in the US, in Europe, in India, in Brazil, in South Africa, even in Russia, and the rest of the world. So this Trump shock is, of course, is brutal, is not the right thing to do, but China has to change its economic model because it cannot be anymore the dumping ground for its excess capacity. That's not acceptable to the US, it's not acceptable to Europe, it's not acceptable to the Global South, it's not acceptable to anybody else.
we're running out of time right now, but right at the, I mean, it's hard to know exactly what Trump was trying to do with his tariff policy. There's all sorts of, the administration seems to give a different explanation every day, from reindustrialization of America to collecting revenues to tackling China or whatever. But it seems to me that if there's a consistency through the administration's policy, it's dealing with America's fiscal problems, its debt and its deficit. And you talked about the Republican Party as being a guardrail, but I mean, just briefly, how do you see the fiscal situation in America playing into this? Do you think that that the fiscal position gets worse as a result of a slower economy and the tariff problems, and do you think that this budget that they're trying to do can finally start to get America's deficit and fiscal problems under control?
I mean, U.S. has an unsustainable debt problem, but so does Europe, so does Japan, so does most of the rest of the world. And if you worry about the dynamic of U.S. debt, U.S. is going to have more potential growth, has better population growth compared to aging China or aging Europe or aging Japan. And Europe potential growth in Eurozone is what, 1%. U.S. is 2, going to 3, going to 4. And growth can resolve most debt problems. The rest of the world is going to reply to this demand shock to the rest of the world with fiscal stimulus. You get in Europe, more defense, more infrastructure, more this, monetary easing, and China is going to do the same, monetary and fiscal easing. In the US instead, the Fed cannot do easing because inflation is going to go higher, so the Fed is going to stay on hold. And the plan of Bessent and the Republican is actually to try to avoid a spike in bond yields by doing fiscal retrenchment. If you look at the plan in Congress, making the tax cuts of 17 permanent doesn't change the baseline, because the baseline is $1.8 trillion deficit last year and this year. So what's going to happen next year with the tax plan? The baseline is 1.8, but then you have tariff revenues of 300 billion. You're going to have another tax spending cuts of DOGE of maybe 50 billion. Then you're going to cut subsidies to IRA and green energy. You're going to cut Medicaid transfers to the states. You're going to raise some taxes, even on the rich. Even the Republicans are thinking about raising the top rate from 37 to 40, because they need revenues from the rich to help the left behind. So all these things actually imply a massive fiscal drag. What's going to instead reduce that fiscal drag is they promise another $150 billion a year of tax cuts. No tax cuts, no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, no taxes on Social Security, no taxes on Americans who are residing abroad. But you have about $500 billion of tax increases and spending cuts. You have $150 billion of tax cuts. The net of it is about 1.5% of GDP fiscal drag. So the US deficit actually is not going to increase next year. It's going to contract. Now, if there is a recession and the economy goes into recession and the Fed cannot cut rates because the recession is caused by inflation, they're going to give up on their fiscal plan. And instead of a fiscal drag next year, you get a fiscal stimulus, small and so on. But they know that actually, if the fiscal deficit blows up, given the stock of the debt, bond yields are going to go through the roof, the bond vigilantes are going to wake up even more, and then that destroys the economy. Because it's not the stock market that matters for the economy, it's the bond market, because everything, mortgages, auto loans, student loans, personal loans, credit card, depends on the 10-year bond yield. So from their point of view, fiscal consolidation, as long as there is not a recession, is the way to go, and the current plan is actually to constrain the deficit in the United States. Rest of the world is different. Everybody's going to have to fiscal stimulus. But that's why currencies in the rest of the world are going to strengthen, and the dollar is going to weaken. Because in the rest of the world, you have fiscal stimulus. In the US, you have fiscal contraction. So that relative fiscal stance is one of the reasons why the dollar gradually is going to weaken. That is some of the things that they like over time, as long as it's orderly.
Well, Nouriel, we're out of time, but I'm very heartened by your analysis that the guardrails are working, and that some grown-ups, at the very least, may be back in charge, and that the long-term prospects for productivity, changing technology, for America, if not for the whole world, are just around the corner, and that's something to hold on to. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Yeah.